Good morning.
Good morning.
How you doing? So, is this too loud or very good? Can we make it louder? No. Good morning. So, welcome everyone who is here with us today. Welcome for those people who are watching online. So, here we go. It's the last week, fifth week in our series about the sacrificial system, and I'm going to spend time kind of helping to sort of talk about some things that are very relevant in terms of the New Testament, but wrapping up and sort of tying everything that we talked about through the first 4 weeks. So where we started is in week 1. So this is about the sacrificial system. And 4 weeks ago, I opened with talking about the tabernacle, which is really the origin of the sacrificial system. And to give you a little bit of background, so a lot of this is really good and important context in terms of what we're going to be talking about today, and especially where we're going, in these upcoming weeks with Palm Sunday, Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter. So what hopefully is going to come from this as we wrap this up and sort of tie this all together is that the significance about the sacrificial system and everything that we've talked about here in the first 4 weeks will help you gain a much, much greater appreciation about the most important holidays that we celebrate as Christians. And to start with, again, sort of the origin of the whole sacrificial system and where we started in week 1 was on the tabernacle. So to get really sort of a good feel for sort of the importance and relevance of the sacrificial system and what it means in terms of Jesus' death on the cross and what it means for us and our beliefs, all started back within the Old Testament, post the Jews' exodus from Egypt, from slavery. And as, Moses, through God's power, led, the Jews, out of Egypt, out of bondage. That was the time that Moses then went up to Mount Sinai and received the 10 Commandments and the laws of the land for the Jewish people. And God's expectation relative to those laws was that the Jewish people would follow those laws to the letter of the law. I mean, it was very, very intentional that, that the Jewish people had to obey the laws and follow them, very strictly and, down to the T, with perfection. Well, naturally, given the fact that the Jewish people are humans and representative of all human beings, that was ultimately an impossible task. I mean, nobody can perfectly follow through on anything because of our human nature, because of our sinful nature. So to sort of set up the whole notion of the tabernacle, which sort of sets up the sacrificial system, is that it's sort of twofold. So as the Jews were exodus, as they were freed from slavery, before that they reached the promised land, which is ultimately the destination of the Jewish people, they wandered in the desert for 40 years. And again, as I shared, they received, Moses received the laws of the land, from God. But the sort of purpose of the tabernacle was that as the Jewish people were wandering in the desert, God wanted to be with his chosen people. So he called the Jewish people to build a tabernacle. And all the tabernacle is really simply a tent, with a surrounding courtyard. And within that surrounding courtyard, there were sacrifices that were performed. And then within the tent itself was where God dwelled. But the tent was divided into 2 pieces. And this detail is really, sounds a bit trivial, but super, super important as we build upon this, throughout this session. But the tent itself was separated into 2 pieces, two places, 2 areas. The first, as you entered the tent, was the holy place. And the second part of the tent was separated by a curtain. And we're going to talk a lot about this curtain. It's very symbolic, very, very critical. But behind that curtain was the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant, and within the Ark of the Covenant was the broken tablets of the 10 Commandments, the laws, the critical foundation of the laws of the Jewish people. On top of the Ark of the Covenant was a gold plate called the mercy seat, and on that mercy seat is in essence where God had dwelled within the tent. right? So again, God wanted to dwell with the people. The only presence or the only knowledge that people had of God being in the presence within the tabernacle, outside of the tabernacle, was that during the day there was a cloud of smoke that came from the tabernacle, and at night there was a pillar of fire. So 2.5 million Jewish people surrounding this tabernacle as they were wandering throughout the desert knew that God was present based on this cloud of smoke and this pillar of fire. And that's how they knew that God was dwelling amongst his people. But physically going into the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle that was separated by this curtain was absolutely forbidden. That nobody could come through there except one person, and that one person was the high priest. And the high priest could only come there once a year, and he came there once a year to sacrifice goat and spread the blood of the goat from the sacrifice on the Ark of the Covenant for the forgiveness of the sins that the Jewish people committed in the past year relative to the laws of the land that God expected the Jewish people to follow to the letter of the law. But the importance of this whole thing relative to the whole notion of sacrifice, is the fact that the only way that we become reconciled with God is through sacrifice. And it's through the blood of the sacrifice that there's a reconciliation that occurs between man and God. And thus the whole separation by the curtain, was really sort of meant to be that we couldn't come into man, actually the Jewish people and man cannot come into the presence of God unless there's an actual perfect sacrifice that has taken place. And actually that's the separation that exists, that from the time that Adam and Eve committed sin in the Garden of Eden, the gates of heaven were closed, and our ability to come in God's presence would only happen after a perfect sacrifice would occur at some point in time. So kind of following this trail, and then we're going to continue to sort of build upon this as we moved into weeks 2, 3, and 4. Week 2, finally, the Jewish people were able to make it into the Promised Land, and when they made it into the Promised Land, the Jewish people, like all surrounding nations, wanted to build a temple for their God, right? Because all surrounding nations had a building and had a shrine or had a place where the God resided. The Jewish people wanted to do the same thing. And they built this temple in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. A real important notation in this. And Solomon built this first temple, which ultimately replaced the tabernacle. But the temple was built with the same sort of structure in mind as the tabernacle, in that there was a separation. There was in the temple there was the holy place, which only the priests could go into, and the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant resided, and a curtain that separated the two. And the same restrictions in terms of only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement once a year to do the sacrifice for the Jewish people. And then as we moved into week 3, then, Don, had talked about the destruction of that first temple that was built in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, and the Jews exiled to Babylonia for a period of 70 years. And by the fact that the temple was destroyed, the sacrificial system ceased to continue, because no temple, no sacrificial system. After 70 years, the Jewish people were able to come back to Jerusalem. And then the 4th week, we talked about the rebuilding of the second temple, which was built by Zerubbabel. I can't say that 3 times too quickly. If you can, come up here. I mean, it's a challenge. Zerubbabel, right? He rebuilt the second temple, and then Herod, sometime later, refurbished and made this an incredibly huge, majestic temple that again was built on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. And it was that second temple that existed at the time that Jesus came on the scene, right? And that brings us here to the present of what we're going to be talking about. So the one thing, so it's, we've this is the 5th week, and we've thrown a lot of stuff at you. But if I were to sort of say, okay, the main takeaway, if there's nothing that you can remember, these are the 2 points that I absolutely hope that we could help you forever remember, because it's so foundational to our belief, not only what we believe, but why we believe it. But it's like God's purpose for the sacrificial system. So as I talked about, the purpose of the sacrificial system was to provide, God provided some mechanism to forgive the Jewish people for not following the letter of the law of the laws, and create some reconciliation. That is the purpose of sacrifice. I mean, it's a reconciling event between God and man. But what's important to know about the sacrificial system and the implication of the sacrifice relative to the reconciliation between man and God is that unless that sacrifice is a perfect sacrifice, and how I would define a perfect sacrifice, or how a perfect sacrifice is defined, is it can't be an animal for a man, in terms of the sacrifice. That only provides temporary forgiveness by God, but it has to be a perfect sacrifice, which means, given the fact that it was Adam and Eve, it was man that sinned, you need a man to be a sacrifice, to have it be any chance of being a reconciling item, and also that the fact that the man has to be a perfect man, right? And with a perfect sacrifice, for a perfect substitutionary sacrifice, and having it be, a man, that would provide forgiveness for eternity. So God would forgive not only sins of the past, but He would forever forgive sins of the future. And in essence, that really tells the story of, like when we talk about like the whole thing that I talked about, like I think the first week that I was here on this topic was sort of linking the whole notion of witnessing, right? So as we witness, it seemed to me like, it was certainly sort of the first question that came to my mind when someone says, okay, tell me what you believe. Well, we believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. And it's like, well, why did Jesus Christ have to die on the cross? I mean, could have there been some other way? Well, it's everything that we've talked about here in this first 4 weeks. It's the Old Testament foundation about the sacrificial system and God's notion of reconciliation through sacrifice, and God's notion of complete reconciliation through sacrifice, through a perfect sacrifice, which is a man, it's a perfect man. It's the ultimate intent of why God had sent the Messiah. I mean, God sent the Messiah purposefully to create that perfect reconciliation through a sacrifice, through a perfect sacrifice. Lots of emphasis on this, but it's contextual in terms of where we're going now. So now as we get into, the whole last week of Jesus' ministry, and again, this first 4 weeks, like what's happening here in Palm Sunday in the last week of Jesus' life means nothing if you don't really means nothing in the way of understanding. It means a whole lot, but it means nothing in terms of understanding if you don't recognize that the foundation of everything that's happening in this last week is everything that we talked about in the first 4 weeks, right? I mean, the whole, like Jesus coming to town and ultimately being sacrificed, did not originate. This whole notion of sacrifice did not originate in the New Testament. It's all linked. I mean, Old Testament links with the New Testament. So we've got this last week, and we're going to start here with Palm Sunday in terms of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And we're going to be talking here in Matthew. If you go to Matthew chapter 21, and starting with verse 1. Actually, the first several verses is just really Jesus, calling his disciples. They're heading up to Jerusalem. It's the last week. They're going up, entering town. Jesus calls his disciples to go get a donkey so that Jesus could ride into Jerusalem on a donkey with his 12 disciples. And then, I'll pick up here on verse 6. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd, with emphasis, very large crowd, spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds then went ahead of them, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David." And Son of David is a reference to the Messiah. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." So the first, question too is, again, as we're now here in the last week, is the Jews' mood and expectations on that day. So what you need to realize is that this is now the third year that Jesus has ministered, throughout Israel. And the people got to know him. They got to see all the stuff that Jesus was doing. And he was doing some incredible things. I mean, performing miracles. His words were beyond people's understanding and imagination at times. But what really was happening was that, again, the Jewish people have been waiting for the coming of a Messiah for many, many years, right? Up until that point. And here's Jesus on the scene, and everything about Jesus had the Jewish people believing that the Messiah had finally was here and finally had come. And they were right. However, what their expectations in terms of what Jesus would be doing as he was coming into Jerusalem was the fact that he was going to come into Jerusalem, he was going to overthrow the Romans, and then the Jews would have 100% control of Israel, the promised land, and that from that point forward that they would live in peace. And that Jesus would come in there, and again, he's coming in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem is where the temple's at, on Mount Moriah, where the temple and the sacrificial system and God's dwelling place, and that Jesus would not only overthrow the Romans, but his throne, which is in the Holy of Holies, he would sit upon that throne, and it would be happy ever after. That was the Jews' expectation and mood at that point in time. However, that wasn't Jesus' expectation on that day in the coming week. And in Matthew, a chapter before that, Matthew chapter 20, verse 17 through 19, let's hear what Jesus' expectation. And this is just before Jesus is entering Jerusalem. He, tells his disciples, we're going on a road trip, we're headed to Jerusalem, and this is what he says. He says, "Now as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, 'We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified,' i.e. sacrificed. 'On the third day he will be raised to life.'" So, Jews' expectations, Jesus' expectations. He is the Messiah. The Jewish people definitely had that right. But Jesus wasn't saying, "Hey, I'm coming to town to overthrow the Romans and bring peace to the land and sit on the throne, on Mount Moriah in the temple." I mean, it was quite the opposite. He was basically saying, "I'm coming here, we're coming to Jerusalem, and I'm getting ready to be this perfect sacrifice because the Son of Man, i.e. the Messiah, that was the whole objective of God from the time that Adam and Eve had sinned, that a Messiah would come, and it would be in the manner in which the reconciliation between man and God, such that the gates of heaven would open, such that all people after death can go to heaven and be in the presence of God, could only come through a perfect sacrifice. And that's what he's saying. So it's not as though that Jesus got caught off guard by what happened, in his crucifixion. I mean, he knew exactly what was going to happen. He knew his purpose. Now, the question is like, he's telling this to the 12 disciples about we're heading into Jerusalem, and this is what's going to happen here in this upcoming week. Do you think that the 12 disciples understood what was going to happen? I mean, not at all, right? I mean, they had their feelings in terms of what was going to happen was no different than the crowds of people that were surrounded, and they too, I mean, felt that, hey, this is the Messiah. I mean, I'm pretty convinced that they were convinced that this is the Messiah, but again, their expectations were that a Messiah that was going to be a king on earth, overthrow the Romans, etc., right, and peace on earth. So when he's saying this, I mean, they're probably scratching their heads and not getting it. And there's some more evidence of that is I'm going to move here to the next section. But again, the relationship to the sacrificial system, again, I mean, this whole setup in the first 4 weeks about the Old Testament sacrificial system, that's what's happening here, right? I mean, Jesus is coming and he's finishing off the purpose of the sacrificial system, right? He is now going to become the perfect sacrifice, and the system that was in place is going to become quickly obsolete for good reason, right? There will be no need for continued animal sacrifices because sins will be forgiven for the past and the future. So that's the relationship to the sacrificial system and what's happening here on Palm Sunday and the setup and the mood. So now, there we go. It's Monday, not to be confused with Monday. So that is the misspell. It's Monday, Thursday, right? The Thursday night in the upper room, Last Supper, 4 days after he entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And what's happening here? So the Last Supper was a Passover meal, right? It wouldn't have been my choice for a Last Supper, but that was Jesus' choice. But it was an important choice. I mean, it was a very purposeful choice. And to get any sort of context and meaning on this purposeful choice in terms of having a Passover meal as his last meal and being with his 12 disciples one last time for breaking of bread, you have to understand a little bit of the history around the Passover. Right now I know Don and I mean, we've done like 4 or 5 Passover meals, so there's a tremendous amount of significance. I think we spent 2 hours, doing the whole Passover meal, and it's got tremendous relevance and insights. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. Hopefully someday we'll get to do that again. So in the 2 hours, I'm going to try and do it in about 3 or 4 minutes. So, but very relative to the whole notion of the sacrificial system. So first you got to understand, so the Passover meal was born from the time, again, when Moses, through God's power, was helping to free the Jewish people from the Pharaoh in Egypt, right? And the manner in which they were going about it was through the plagues, the 10 plagues. Well, the first 9 plagues struck out in terms of convincing the Pharaoh to free the Jewish people from slavery. And then, Moses said, hey, Pharaoh, the 10th plague is going to come from your mouth. And sure enough, the Pharaoh sort of declared that the firstborn of Egypt will be slain, will be killed. With that pronouncement, that was the pronouncement of the 10th plague, and the Jewish people, understanding that, kind of went and spent 4 days' time, we're called to spend 4 days' time, and look at the lamb, the flock, the lamb that was within their respective flocks, and after 4 days, to pick out the best lamb of their flock and sacrifice it. And with that sacrifice and the blood of the sacrifice, the Jewish people, and it's probably a familiar story, but we're going to connect this together more tightly, is that they spread the blood of the lamb across the doorpost of the Jewish homes, and then when the angel of death came in, it passed over the Jewish people's house and freed the firstborn Jews from death, and then killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians, and then lo and behold, the Pharaoh finally freed the Jewish people from slavery. So it worked, right? But the important part of this is that it was such a significant event, in terms of what God had done for the Jewish people, that he called the Jewish people from that point forward, that on an annual basis, that they needed to celebrate the Passover once a year. And they needed to celebrate the Passover for a very, very purposeful point, not just because it's a great memory, but beyond that, it's because ultimately everything that I just described in terms of finding the lamb, finding the perfect lamb, sacrificing that lamb, taking the blood of the lamb, and the blood of the lamb ultimately freeing the firstborn from death, was extremely, extremely purposeful. And not only was it purposeful, it was in essence a foreshadow of what the Messiah would do when the Messiah would come, which is why God called the Jewish people to celebrate that year in and year out, so that would be etched in their minds in terms of the meaning of sacrifice and what the sacrifice would do, and ultimately a foreshadow of what the Messiah would do when the Messiah would come, i.e. the Messiah would come, would be sacrificed, and the blood from that sacrifice would ultimately be the perfect sacrifice, and that blood would free people from death forevermore, right? But again, the Passover meal, the Passover that was to be celebrated would only be celebrated up to into the time of the coming of the Messiah, because again, once the Messiah would come, there would be no need to have to look backwards to that event. So now we're in the upper room, and that's sort of the context or lead into. And Jesus is having this Last Supper, which was it didn't happen to be, but very purposely was the Passover meal. And to understand like what's happening in the way that Jesus was celebrating, which he celebrated it no differently than all the Jewish people had celebrated up until a point, and then there was a pivot. But the way that the Passover meal is celebrated is through the telling of the story, and the telling of the story is told through the food that's on the table. And the primary pieces of food that are on the table in a Passover meal are bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and a roasted lamb. And then to drink, there's red wine, right? Which, when you go through the significance of their telling the story of the Passover meal, the bitter herbs is to remember the bitterness of slavery. The unleavened bread is to remember the haste that the people had to leave Israel, or leave Egypt, as they were being freed from slavery, that they didn't have time for the bread to rise, i.e. it was unleavened. And then certainly the lamb and the red wine was to remember the sacrifice of the lamb and the blood of the lamb as a freeing of the firstborn from death. So Jesus went through this whole thing the same way that the Jews celebrated, going through the story with his disciples. And then there was a pivot. And then the pivot was that Jesus then talked about, again, the fact of this is what's about to happen to me. I'm going to be sacrificed, and from this point forward, and the blood from my sacrifice is going to free you from death. I mean, not just from past sins, but future sins, and free you from death, and ultimately enable us to come in the presence of God in heaven. He's announcing this right here in the room, right after the meal. He's making the pronouncement. I am now the New Testament. I am the New Testament lamb, and the blood from this lamb is going to free everybody from death. That pronouncement is huge because, in essence, that was the purpose of the Messiah. So to just give you a little bit of a taste of that, that's in chapter 26, verses 26 through 29, and I think this is going to sound pretty familiar to everybody. But while Jesus again was at the table, he says, while they were eating, Jesus took bread and gave thanks and broke it and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it anew with you on my Father's kingdom." So, and here it is now. Now Jesus is now pronounced that he's the lamb to be remembered, and the blood from that lamb is to forever be remembered. So it was like a baton passing, right? So now from that point forward, what Jesus is saying is like this Passover meal that's been celebrated for all these years that God has called us to remember and to do year in and year out, it has now served its purpose because it's foreshadowed the coming of the Messiah. But once the Messiah came, it was no longer to remember the past Passover. He now wanted to remember the New Testament Passover. And then as you could hear those words, I mean, those words sound familiar because we say them every single week right before we do communion. So every single week when we're taking communion, we are celebrating the Passover and the remembrance of what Jesus' sacrifice and blood did for us. So that's the connectivity to that. So then, if you're to then say, okay, well, if you ask the question, well, how do we know that the sacrifice, because now we're on Good Friday, so and Jesus is sacrificed on the cross, as we know. But the real question is like, how do we know for sure that just because Jesus Christ has made all these pronouncements and that he was sacrificed on the cross, and the purpose of him being the Messiah, or his claim to being the Messiah, was that in order for that claim to be real, that his sacrifice and the blood from his sacrifice truly had to open the gates of heaven, break down the curtain, and enable us to come in God's presence. How do we know for certain that Jesus wasn't just a fraud or a fake, or that he wasn't the real deal? Right? So first of all, we know that from, and I'll come back to this other point here in a second, but we know that from the Matthew chapter 27, verse 50-51, where just right before Jesus dies, in verse 50, he said, "And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." And then it goes on to talk a little bit about sort of the enormity of the situation. But at the point that he was sacrificed, right, again, how do we know that Jesus is the real deal? Well, symbolically, right at that point, the curtain that we've been talking about through these whole 5 weeks, where it's like, hey, pay attention to the curtain, pay attention to the curtain, it has some real meaning, it has huge meaning. So symbolically, when that curtain was torn in two from top to bottom, what it signified was that sacrifice worked. That's the key. That's the key that opens the gate to heaven. And by the tearing of the curtain in two, it symbolizes the fact that before, where only the high priest could come in God's presence, with the curtain torn in two, it says that all mankind could come into the presence, right? Because the perfect sacrifice has taken place. There's no need to repeat the sacrifice on an annual basis anymore. The work is done, right? So that's pure evidence. Then also, like, what is the second piece of evidence? The most important piece or second piece of that evidence is his resurrection, right? So if the whole purpose of the sacrifice was to be able to come in God's presence in heaven, right? We know that the curtain is torn in two, very symbolic. What's even more symbolic is the fact that 3 days after Jesus died on the cross, he was resurrected from the dead, right? So the proof point that there is life after death through the perfect sacrifice. The 2 points of evidence that the Messiah was truly the Messiah, that Jesus truly was the Messiah, in this whole notion of sacrifice, which is sort of setting up throughout the whole Old Testament, all the way up to the time of the coming of the Messiah. He'd done the trick, that it's real, right? So that the imperfect sacrifices didn't quite do it, so all of these things were repeated on an annual basis. But lo and behold, when the perfect sacrifice came, opened the gates to heaven, will allow us to come in God's presence, through the price that he paid on our behalf. So that's that. So then to sort of fast forward here a little bit too, we've got that in 40 years after Jesus' death, the temple in 70 AD, the temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem was completely destroyed by the Romans, obliterated to the ground, nothing left, from this. And then the Jews were dispersed across the world, right? So that's 70 AD. So now, what does that mean after 70 AD? So like without the sacrificial system, again, the Jewish people can't perform sacrifices. They can't celebrate their high holidays and whatnot. So where's the temple today? Have they rebuilt the temple? Is it back on Mount Moriah? The answer is no, right? So from 70 AD to today, there's no temple. There was never a rebuild of temple. In fact, what's sitting on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem is the Dome of the Rock, which is a Muslim shrine, which is thought to be the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven. So why is that significant and why is that important? Because of this. Because now if you ask the question like, well, do the Jewish people want to build the temple? Is that why the temple hasn't been rebuilt and that they haven't started their sacrificial system? They 1,000% want to rebuild the temple, and they 1,000% want to resume the sacrificial system. But with that Dome of the Rock and in control of the Muslims, that if the Jewish people were to ever try to do away with the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the temple, it's World War III at its heights. It just could not happen. So anything that we're sort of experiencing in today's world with what's going on, pales in comparison to what would happen if, in fact, the Jewish people would try to regain control of the Temple Mount and rebuild the temple. So why is that? So what is the relevance or significance of that? So to close with these 2 points, right? So we've talked a lot about the Day of Atonement, which is, again, what the high priest would do when he went into the tabernacle or went into the temple once a year with the blood from goats and perform the sacrifice to free the Jews or forgive the Jews of their sins of the past year. And that's repeated year in and year out. And then the Passover, just like what we just talked about. Every single year in the Passover, up until the time of the temple destruction, the Jewish people would sacrifice a lamb. That lamb would be on the plate, of their Passover meal as a remembrance of the Passover of the past, right? Of the events that took place in Egypt. So, did the Jews stop celebrating the Day of Atonement and Passover? I'll give you the answer. The answer is no. They're still celebrating these events to this very day, but they're doing it without the sacrifice of animals, right? Which is really central to both of these holidays. And they're doing it without sacrifice because the temple's destroyed. There's no official place to perform sacrifice anymore. So then you ask the question of, again, what's going on here? Well, this is where God comes into play, right? I mean, in God's sovereignty, I mean, and this is, this is an element of speculation. I mean, anybody could come up with any answer in terms of why the temple hasn't been rebuilt and whatnot. But everything that, like we're talking about, like the Day of Atonement, the sacrificial system, in its imperfect form, again, was a foreshadow to the perfect sacrifice. But it wasn't intended to be a forever thing. It was intended to be there as sort of a Band-Aid until the Messiah came. When the Messiah would come, and there would be the perfect sacrifice, and man would be fully reconciled with God, there's no need for sacrifice anymore, right? So as a result, it potentially is a coincidence that this temple has never been rebuilt, but I think it's beyond coincidence. I think it's in God's sovereign way of saying, no need for sacrifice anymore. The perfect sacrifice has taken place. So that's 5 weeks. Exhale. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. But we got plenty of time for Q&A. So feel free to ask any questions about today, of anything that we've done in the last 4 weeks, about what I'm doing later today. We could talk a little bit. Okay, we got one right up here, Don.
Okay, hold on.
So
that was amazing. That was very, very intriguing. A couple of questions. With the tearing of the curtain at the crucifixion, and do Jewish people recognize Jesus? I've always gone through life with the understanding that Jews don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. They don't do that. They don't believe in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the nation of Israel, the Jewish leaders, do not recognize that Jesus is the Messiah.
Okay. And then the Dome of the Rock. You made a statement that I had never heard before, that if the Jewish state of Israel, or were to ever try to overthrow the Dome of the Rock or destroy it and build their temple, that would lead to World War III.
Yeah, I mean,
and the consequences would be mind-boggling and very, very deadly. Why is that?
I mean, it's a sacred place. I mean, it's the for the Muslims, I mean, they do pilgrimages each year. And what's sort of interesting, because it's sort of the interesting point about that is that what I failed to mention, like on that spot, it's the most holy spot in the entire world. It's thought that life was begun on that spot, Adam and Eve. It's the place where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac, and it's the and the Muslims have total claim to Abraham too, right? And then it's also had become the place where it's thought that Muhammad ascended into heaven, and they've built their shrine there. So as passionate as any of us are about our religions and faith, they're equally as passionate about it, to the point of there's no way in the world that they would allow that to happen without extreme amounts of conflict. And it's been evidenced, right, a number of times where the Jews have taken a shot at trying to rebuild the temple, and it's caused instant conflict.
Do you think that's because God is saying it's done?
Yeah, I mean, so that was the linkage where I was trying to go. I mean, so much so that God has almost created sort of like a conundrum, where a purposeful conundrum where I mean, this is nobody has the exact answer to this, but it feels like in God's sovereign nature that He does not want the sacrificial system to continue, because it would sort of belittle the whole point of sacrifice and what was really intended.
Well, it certainly would be counter to what we learned about the sacrificial system.
Yes.
Yeah, and don't forget too, we talked about this in the previous weeks, with the Temple Mount itself, the Jews have tried to lay the cornerstone of the temple. And in the previous weeks, I had the diagram of how the Temple Mount is laid out. It's about 30 acres, 27 acres is the whole Temple Mount. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a holy mosque for Islam, the Dome of the Rock, which is the third holiest site in the world. You got Mecca, Medina, and then the Dome of the Rock, which is, as Dave said, where Muhammad is said to have ascended in heaven, once again mimicking Jesus' ascension into heaven. Okay, they have tried to lay that, and there's a spiritual component going on here. There's obviously geopolitical maneuverings going on throughout the world, just people lobbying for the different parts of the land, whether it's Russia trying to do a land grab on Ukraine or whatever. This is happening throughout the world, but everything revolves around Jerusalem. Everything revolves around the Temple Mount because of what Dave has said with the sacrificial system, and that will not happen. I absolutely believe in the end times that there will be many moving parts that all revolve around Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and when that happens, it will be World War III or IV or V or whatever, wherever we're at in history, right? And so that is key. The entire world, like I said weeks past, it's like a magnet, and the entire world is just drawn to that area. So, other questions?
Do the Jewish people, do they recognize the tearing of the temple curtain? And if they do, what would they attribute that to?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I quite frankly don't know, right? I mean, I don't,
Well, so I can't speak to that. So Dave grew up in a Jewish home.
And I was bar mitzvahed and he wasn't.
So we can pass over Saturdays together because we love this.
The combination of the two.
Yeah. So this Gentile has gone into the synagogues and talked to the rabbis in Northbrook and other places and asked specifically that question. There's an entire history behind that. But this goes back, so just let me take you back to last week in my talk. Zerubbabel's temple is built, Herod adds on to it, and now you have this system. And I talked about this character, Antiochus Epiphanes, 168 BC. He desecrated the temple, the second temple. He desecrated it, slaughtered a pig, put the blood on whatever was in the Holy of Holies, and it was the Maccabean revolt and all this stuff. That was all a picture of what was going on. I absolutely, as I said last week, do not believe the Shekinah glory of God, which Dave said dwelled on the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, did not return in the second temple. I do not believe it did. Neither do I believe the Ark of the Covenant was in there. That's therefore why God Shekinah glory didn't return. So you have around 400 BC, you have 4 centuries before the glory returned, as Dave said today on Palm Sunday, Jesus Christ returns to the temple. The Shekinah glory in the person of Jesus is returning at that moment. To answer your question about the curtain, I believe it was a charade. I believe that the high priests, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and that whole religious system, they knew the temple, beyond the temple curtain, it was an empty room. They didn't have the Ark of the Covenant. I believe that took place for 4 centuries. When the temple curtain tore, don't forget, Paul says in his epistles that Jesus was the curtain. He is the curtain through which we pass. We don't enter into God's presence except entering through Jesus Christ. He is the curtain. Yeah. When it tore in two, as his body was broken on the cross, that's why that happened at that moment. Chuck, you were going to say?
Yeah, wow, that is something I've never heard before. So you believe up until the point that Christ is crucified, the holies of holies is a charade. It's a farce.
I believe so.
You think they were just perpetrating a fraud on the Jewish people, and that Christ himself was the curtain, and as you said, when his body was broken on the cross, that signified the open invitation and the open door to heaven.
I mean, I don't. So I don't like. I mean, I don't know if there was any fraud perpetrated or whatever. But I mean, I think really. I mean, to not get like overly deep on this. I mean, really, at least from my perspective, it's a symbolic thing, right? If nothing else, I mean, I want to like. I mean, there could be lots of speculation on whether there was or wasn't. But the real thing to walk away with that everybody I think should be able to digest. It's symbolic of the fact that the perfect sacrifice has taken its place, and now we could come in God's presence. That's the most. And secondly, even more so, even if it was, like, I mean, like what one person's opinion is, you know, if you were to ask, you know, a rabbi or whatever. I mean, nobody really knows for certain. But what's undeniable, though, I mean, beyond the tearing of the curtain, is the resurrection. Right? I mean, the only way that there could have been the resurrection, the only way that there could be life after death is that the perfect sacrifice had to occur. So, I mean, if there's nothing else to remember, tearing of curtain is symbolic that we could come in God's presence, and resurrection is, I mean, it's unarguable, right? I mean, there's no gamesmanship in terms of.
We'd still be doing sacrifices.
Or we'd still be doing we'd still be doing sacrifices today. Yeah, that's how it.
Hi. Why was it necessary for the old sacrificial system to stay in place for so many generations?
Because it was, I mean, for the reason that the sacrificial system was very purposeful in terms of why God had set it up, was that until it was again sort of leading, it was foreshadowing to a perfect sacrifice. Well, until the perfect sacrifice occurred, we were left with the imperfect sacrificial system, and it kept having to be repeated because the sacrifice of animals doesn't do the trick. It's not a substitutionary and it's not a perfect sacrifice, so it would repeat itself. But once the perfect sacrifice would happen, that's all sort of this after talk right now in terms of what happened with the destruction of the temple. There's no longer a need for sacrifice. I mean, it diminishes, completely wipes away the whole relevance of the perfect sacrifice.
And remember in Hebrews, it's where he's the high priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he was sacrificed once for all, then he sat down. And remember when we talked about the temple, I said you got this glorious multi-million or billion-dollar temple in today's dollars, and there wasn't a single chair in the temple. So in the high holy days of Solomon's temple, there was not a chair, because of course the priests came in one after another to do their duties of covering the sins of the people, right? Well, now when you get the perfect sacrifice, you don't need that anymore, because Jesus sat down at the right hand of the Father of God. So end of sacrificial system. Before we get to another question, there was a question online, which Dave, I'll pose this and we can talk about it. And it goes, it ties back to John the Baptist. Peter Hupp put this question, said, you have John the Baptist in the wilderness preaching this baptism of repentance. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The Messiah is coming. The Messiah is coming. John the Baptist is a forerunner. Why didn't he do that at the temple? And I'll answer that real quick because for online and for anywhere else that question has come up. When we actually started Mid-Pointe at the beginning of this year, again, started it back up, we did Unlikely Heroes of the Bible, and I talked about John the Baptist, and, you know, he was a black and white guy, no gray, things were right, things were wrong. And part of his ministry was the calling of Israel to repentance before the Messiah came, okay? But he was doing this in total rebellion and total objection and total rejection of the system that had become. And this also goes back to the little curtain and part of the charade of the Jews of that day. Okay, of that religious system, mankind is corrupted, and if God hadn't chosen Israel, and you had the Pharisees and Sadducees, maybe He would have chosen the Canaanites, or He would have chosen another people. Okay, maybe one of our descendants, right? We would have done the same thing. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the Jews had absolute power over that system. And so John the Baptist said, I want no part of that. I want no part of your flowing robes. I want no part of everything that you are. You have corrupted yourselves. I'm going out in the desert, and I'm going to wear sackcloth, and I'm going to eat locusts. And I'm going to be totally opposite of what they are. So that's why He did that out in the wilderness rather than at the temple.
Yeah, let me there's an important point, right? I mean, now this is... we've done this we've reborn Mid-Pointe for a year. This is the 6th talk. And naturally, I mean, I'll get a lot of questions asked about what about the Jews and all of that stuff, which is natural. I mean, I'm Jewish. I've got a lot of that insight and perspective. But the one thing that I don't want to lose sight of, I mean, the Jews are very passionate, extremely as passionate about love for God as we are as Christians. And also, I mean, and Don sort of alluded to a point that I think is really, really important as we say, okay, what about the Jews? What would they do, or how would they think, or whatnot? The fact of the matter is that God chose the Jewish people. They are the chosen people. He chose them because, they're not better or worse, but 1,000% representative of every other human being on the face of this earth. It's almost as though that He used the Jewish people, incubated the Jewish people for His broader purposes, which was to reconcile man to God. Man to God, all of His creation, 100% of His creation. So whether, so like I'm always a little bit careful in terms of like, they didn't get it or whatever. They got it as much as anybody else would get it. And that's a fact. And again, God's purposes and meaning for all of us is the same. We're all of God's creation, no matter which angle or direction or skin color or gender or whatever. We're all of God's creation. All of what we're talking about is meant for everybody. And everybody is flawed as the next guy, and everybody is as good as the next person. So just want to make that point pretty clear.
Any other questions? We have about a minute for it. And Amy, if you want to start, praise team, come up to the stage. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to have a commercial. Okay, so we wrap up this, and we have 2 weeks off. Next week is Palm Sunday, no adult education, and then of course it's Easter. We all celebrate that, and then we have a 5-week series, which is listed in your bulletin, where we're going to talk about characters of the chosen. Once again, our small groups, Pastor's sermon series, and Mid-Pointe is going to be focused on the chosen, that series, which you can stream online for free. More to come on that. And our 5 weeks are going to focus on the personalities of the chosen rather than the themes. So, Parker, Amy, we'll hand it over to you. And thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Please rise with us as we get ready for our message today.
into your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace, light of the world. I'm running to your arms. I'm running to your arms. The riches of your love will always be enough. Nothing compares to your embrace, light of the world. My heart will sing no other name. Jesus, Jesus. My heart will sing no other name. Jesus, Jesus.
Thank you, and feel free to join us again in 10 minutes. We'll see you soon.